My name is Srđan Vučetić. Welcome to the first session of the International Theory Network, one of the 4 research networks here at the Center for International Policy Studies. I'm one of the coordinators and co-founders. Kevin McMillan is the other guy. So we have absolute pleasure today to introduce Professor Paul Robinson, who's my colleague at the Graduate School for Public and International Affairs. Professor Robinson works on military stuff, but not just military stuff, also Russia, Russian foreign policy, Russian history, Russian military history, military ethics, and a few other things. 5 books or 6 books?
7, I think.
7 books! I'm sorry, 7 books. Yeah, so you write faster than I read, sir. So yeah, and also blogs, not just at the SIPS blog, which you should read, but also at his own blog called Eurasianism at WordPress.com, which I read quite a bit, and I find it amazing. So today Professor Robinson will speak on conservatism and Russian international relations theory. It's one of his current research projects. I had a chance to look at the paper, and I can tell you it's going to be fabulous. So Q&A will be, I guess, trilingual, en français, par ruski,
yeah,
and in English. Okay. Thank you for coming and doing this for us. Please join me in welcoming our local talent.
Okay, well, thank you guys for turning out for what is, probably a philosophy talk about, well, not maybe the sexiest of subject compared with, Novichok and the GIU and all that stuff. Yeah, so the subject, conservatism and Russian international relations theory. So a recent survey of Russian international relations scholars asked them to name the Russian thinkers who had had the most influence on international relations theory. And the 3 most commonly cited names were Nikolaev Dostoyevsky, Konstantin William, and Alexander Panarin, at which point you all scratch your heads and go, who the hell are these guys? Okay, so we'll find that out later. From my point of view, what's interesting about these is that all 3 of them are generally considered to be conservatives. So it indicates, I think, the influence that conservative thought has on contemporary Russian views of international relations. So I've just completed a book on the subject of Russian conservatism. It will be published next year. So I intend in this talk to examine how conservative thinking has affected the way that Russian political thinkers view the world. Okay, and that requires a very brief diversion into theories of conservatism, after which we'll go on a sort of historical tour of discovery from the mid-19th century up to today. Because being a historian, I think we need the background before we get on to today. Bear in mind, we're talking mainly about philosophers, not about politicians, though at the end I will try and tie it in with political action. So any attempt to discuss conservatism runs into the immediate difficulty that scholars don't agree on what it is. Now I really don't have time to go into all the various theories of conservatism, but I'll limit myself to saying that it's generally seen as having sort of binary nature, and simplifying things extremely dramatically, which might annoy some political philosophers, but you have to do it in a short talk. One can view conservatism as being either an ideology or as a way of viewing the world. Okay? So as an ideology, conservatism asserts universal values, such as justice, conscience, family, patriotism, and so on. Okay? And these are often religiously based. So conservatism of this sort is a universalist system. By contrast, conservatism as a way of viewing the world is particularist. When I say on this slide that conservatism is positional and organic, what I mean is that the values that conservatives seek will depend on context. So a conservative in a communist society will be a communist, a conservative in a free market liberal democracy will be a free market liberal democrat. So a conservative could be bloody anything, which makes definitions quite difficult. Okay? What marks off this sort of conservatism, it's a way of viewing the world, and what marks the conservative off from others is his or her attitude to change. So the conservative isn't against change, but he or she believes it must be organic in nature, that's to say gradual and respecting the past. But because each nation's past is different, that means there is no single path of progress applicable to all. Each nation should progress in its own way. So conservatism of this sort tends to deny the existence of universal values. Okay? So which then is the true conservatism? And that is impossible to say. In reality, you tend to find both of these things all muddled up with one another. They coexist. So this creates an inevitable tension within conservative thought between its universalist pretensions and its insistence on particularism. And finding ways of overcoming this tension becomes a key element of conservative philosophy. This is very true in the case of Russian conservatism due to a number of factors relating to its origins. Russian conservatism arose in the early 19th century and in some respects can be seen as an offshoot of Western European conservatism. That is to say that it can be seen as a reaction to Enlightenment rationalism, the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. But Russian conservatism differed from its Western European counterpart in one important way. From its start, it was largely a cultural project, reacting against what was seen as the excesses associated with the process of westernization began by Peter the Great. By 1800, Russia had a highly educated elite who were so thoroughly westernized that many of them spoke French better than they spoke Russian. In due course, some of the Russian elite began to feel that in becoming westernized, they had ceased to be Russian. They therefore began to explore alternative modes of development which would allow Russia to move forward without discarding its own native culture. And to do this, they had to develop an ideology which asserted a nation's right to independent development. So in effect, they became conservatives. Seen this way, conservatism in Russia from its very start was strongly associated with anti-Westernism. This means that Russian conservatism is inherently particularist. Russian conservatives reject Western universalism, especially the universalist ideas associated with Western liberalism, and stress instead the right of every nation to develop in its own organic way. At the same time, however, Russian conservatives have often been thoroughly westernized, and in many cases great admirers of the West. And while insisting on Russia's right to a distinctive path of development, they have wanted to connect Russia's future to that of the West, sometimes viewing Russia as having a special mission, which is precisely to save the West from itself. Moreover, when pushed to say what distinguishes Russia from the West, Russian conservatism have tended to single out orthodoxy. Okay? But Orthodox religion is inherently universalist. Okay? So what is particular about Russia is its universalism. Okay? Okay. All this means that the tension between universal and particularism are very noticeable in Russian conservatism. Okay? So, what I want to do from now on, therefore, is look at how Russian conservatives have sought to reconcile the particular and the universal, and show how that has shaped their view of the world. And in the process, I'll argue that Russian conservatives have taken two approaches. One has claimed that Russia's peculiarity is that it is the repository of the universal truth. This trend has therefore insisted that Russia must defend its separate identity for the benefit of mankind as a whole. The second way of dealing with this problem is by identifying the universal good with the promotion of national diversity. The second approach therefore rejects universalism, while at the same time preserving the idea that Russia has a universal mission connected with the promotion of diversity. In line with this logic, many Russian conservatives in the modern era argue that the development of a multipolar world in which nations protect their sovereignty and defend their right to a separate path of development serves not only Russian interests, but those of humanity as a whole. So, to demonstrate this, we have to go back in time to the 1840s and look at a small group of Moscow noblemen known as the Slavic Files. Educated Russians of their era were acutely aware that although Russia was a great military power, it had a definite lack of scientific and cultural achievements to its name. This offended their national pride. The question was what to do about it. One group, known as the Westernizers, argued that Russia should adopt all the most progressive ideas coming out of Europe. The Slavic Files rejected this idea. If that's all Russia did, they argued, it would end up as nothing more than a pale copy of the West. To make a contribution to the world, Russia would have to create something original. And that meant being true to itself and rejecting the path of westernization. End of exercise. How do we get rid? Okay. So, so back to Mr. Sarkov.
Symbolic.
One of the things, one of the Slavic Files there. Okay, so to make this point, the Slavic Files drew on German Romantic philosophy. It's actually quite interesting when you see actually a lot of Russian conservatism, which stresses Russia's distinctiveness, is drawn out of Western philosophy. And even the most adamant Russian nationalists are deeply embedded in the West. So according to Romantic philosophy, each nation makes its contribution to the world by developing what is unique and best about its own culture. So following this logic, the Slavophiles argued that the common good was served not by homogenization in the form of universal westernization, but rather by diversity. As one of the leading Slavophiles, Konstantin William, over there, said, "One must recognize every nationality, from the sum total of which the general human choir is formed. Surely one would not want to make out of humanity some kind of abstract phenomenon where there are no living individual national features. If you remove individual and national colours from humanity, it will be a colourless phenomenon. No, let all nationalities in the human world freely and clearly flower. Only they will activate and energize the common labour of peoples. Long live every nationality." So according to the Slavophiles, Russia's distinctiveness derived from certain values connected with orthodoxy, the exact details of which needn't concern us, and they're rather complicated. The key point is that the Slavophiles believe that by nurturing its distinctiveness and resisting assimilation into the West, Russia could preserve these values not just for its own benefit, but for the benefit of the West, okay? Enabling at some point Russia to reintroduce these ideas into the West and so save it. In this way, said another Slavophile, Alexei Khomyakov, history is calling Russia to take its place in the forefront of universal enlightenment. So the Slavophiles, while pushing Russia's distinctiveness, saw this in terms of universal enlightenment. And this was a theme taken up by some of the next generation of Russian conservatives, one of the most prominent of whom was the famous novelist Fyodor Dostoyevsky. Dostoyevsky devoted himself to reconciling Russia's westernized elite and the mass of still Russian ordinary people. He believed that the elite could give the people science and culture, and in return the people would give the elite their simple faith in Christ. Dostoyevsky then took this a step further and urged a reconciliation also of East and West, through a combination of Western science and Eastern faith. Russia, in Dostoyevsky's eyes, would play a vital role in this process of reconciliation. But to do so, it had to retain its faith and so resist the temptations of Western liberalism, materialism, and atheism. To make this point, Dostoyevsky reversed the Slavophiles' equation. The particular did not serve the universal as the Romantics and Slavophiles claim. Rather, what was particular about Russia was its universality. Its what do you call it? All humanity. And this is kind of difficult to explain, but someone like Dostoyevsky said Russia's different, right? But at the same time, he spoke many Western European languages. He was always off in Western Europe gambling. He was up to date on all the latest Western philosophy. So Russians, in this way, are open to the world while claiming their distinctiveness, in a way that Westerners are not, because how many of us are actually studying German, Russian philosophy, and incorporating it into our ideas? When we talk about globalization, we mean Westernization, really. It's not like we really think we should be borrowing anything from the Russians, right? Okay. So Russia is open to the world in the ways others we are not, and also because it retains its Christian faith, it has a more broad-minded view of the world than purely materialist, rationalist Westerners do. Okay. So Russia embodies this all humanity. And that's what's particular about it. So if Russia could nurture this characteristic, which meant, of course, fending off Western encroachment, then it could, in due course, export it to the West, okay, and so unite the world for a common future. And Dostoyevsky expressed his point of view very eloquently in a letter to Grand Duke Alexander Alexandrovich, who later became Tsar Alexander III. And I tell my students not to put a large number of words on slides, but I'm ignoring my own advice here because it's a good quote and it's worth having it on. Okay? So he said, "We have forgotten that we contain in ourselves as Russians the capacity perhaps to bring new light to the world, on the condition that our development is independent. We have forgotten that all great nations displayed their great powers only to the extent that they were arrogant in their assessment of themselves. And precisely in this way they have benefited the world, and each of them has brought something into it, be it only a single ray of light, because they have remained themselves, proud and steady, arrogantly independent." Makes a great quote. Okay. In essence, what he's saying is Russia's defense of its independence serves the interests of humanity as a whole. Not everybody shared Dostoyevsky's concern for the universal good of mankind. Okay? An example is Nikolaev, the first of the three on my initial slide, who's best known for his 1869 book, Russia and Europe. Russia and Europe can be seen as like the original clash of civilizations written 130 years before Samuel Huntington. In this book, Danilevsky asked why Western countries had shown so little concern about Prussia's invasion of Denmark in 1864, whereas Russia's earlier quarrel with Turkey had caused such hysteria that it led to the Crimean War. He said there's a double standard here, which is something Russians still complain. So why the double standard? And the answer, Danilevsky said, was that Europeans regarded Russia as different. Okay, that's what they got so upset. But the source of this difference wasn't geography. There's no natural geographic boundary separating Russia and Europe. But the source of the difference was culture and history. In short, Russia and Europe were separate civilizations, or as he called them, cultural historical types. And from this, Danilevsky developed the idea that history was not the story of progress of all mankind towards a common future, but rather of different civilizations, each developing in their own way. As such, civilizations could not be properly measured against one another. As he put it, the principles of civilization for one cultural historical type are not transferable to the peoples of another type. Danilevsky thus fervently rejected universalism and asserted the right of Russia and other civilizations to follow their own paths, separate from the West. At the same time, though, he identified a sort of universal good associated with diversity. He wrote, "Progress consists not of everything going in one direction, but of pursuing the whole realm of humanity's historical activity in all directions," adding that the actual profound danger consists of the completion of the very order of things our westernizers hold as their ideal, the reign of the all-human civilization they so admire. This would be the same as ending the whole possibility of any further progress in history, such as the introduction of a new worldview, new goals, and new aspirations. It is not a question of whether the world is controlled by a republic or a monarchy, but whether it is controlled by a single civilization, a single culture, since this would deprive the human race of one of the necessary conditions for success and perfection, the element of diversity. Danilevsky's idea of civilizations and the importance of diversity was adapted by one of his contemporaries, perhaps one of the most eccentric figures in Russian philosophy, Konstantin William, who developed a theory of civilizational life cycles. According to Leontiev, civilizations are like living organisms. They are born, they grow, they die. Since every civilization eventually comes to an end, none can claim to be the bearer of universal truth. Organisms, he noted, begin simple, as just a mass of identical cells. As they grow, they become more and more complex. And as they grow old and eventually die and decay, they decay into simplicity once again. So the life cycle, therefore, has three stages: primary simplicity, flowering complexity, and secondary simplicity. Okay? And if you want your Leontiev buzzword, what you need to remember is flowering complexity. That's like bowdlerized Leontiev. Okay? The same thing applies to civilizations, said Leontiev. So for him, the most important criterion was aesthetic. Okay? Color and variety are aesthetically pleasing. Okay? Homogeneity is boring. and undesirable. He'd have hated modern architecture with all the identical glass towers everywhere and said, no, this is what's wrong with globalization. It's just like boring. Okay? So it follows what one wants is flowering complexity. Okay? This applies both domestically in the sense that you want to have a society which is hierarchical and unequal, but also multicultural. Okay? So these are anti-nationalists. But it also applies at the international level in the sense that one wants to preserve a large number of different national cultures and political and economic systems. According to Ante, by promoting equality and by spreading its universal ideas, Western liberalism was homogenizing everybody, and so accelerating secondary simplicity. Russia had to resist this trend and maintain its own independence so as to remain as long as possible in the period of flowering complexity. And Ante predicted that eventually all the European nations would merge into one simple thing, one nation. But this, rather than this being a sign of progress, this would be a proof of Europe's decay. So the Russian Revolution of 1917 rather put an end to such thinking within Russia. For several decades, it was quite impossible to talk of conservative philosophy in what became the Soviet Union. However, conservative thinking did continue to flourish among those who fled Russia after the revolution, and so it's to émigrés we'll now turn. One of the émigré figures who's attracted the most attention recently is philosopher Ivan Ilyin. Quite a lot has been written in the past couple of years about Ilyin's alleged influence on Vladimir Putin. Most of his writing is garbage, and I advise you to ignore it, particularly Timothy Snyder's recent book, which is just awful. Anyway, so Ilyin was a national.
Comment?
Sorry, yeah?
Can you repeat the last comment?
Oh, I'd say ignore most of the recent stuff that's been said about Ilyin, particularly Timothy Snyder's recent book, which is awful. Truly horrible. Anyway, Ilyin was a nationalist, and people often say, like, this is a really bad thing, and they sort of therefore paint him in a very negative light for being a nationalist. But by doing so, they kind of missed the point of what he means by being a nationalist. Okay? So, to Ilyin, like Romantics and Slavic Files, every nation is a bearer of a little bit of God's truth. Okay? So nationalism meant nurturing and celebrating what God had given you, but without denigrating other nations, because they also contain a little bit of God's truth too. Okay? As he put it, there is no single life-saving recipe for all times and all peoples. There is no single universally obligatory Western culture compared to which everything else is darkness or barbarianism. So what's required, according to Ilyin, is mutual respect of difference. And he put it this way. He said, every people has its own national instinct given to it by nature, and each people and spirit lives in its own way and creates valuable peculiarity. For every national peculiarity in its own way manifests the Holy Spirit, and in its own way glorifies God. In a word, each people has its own special mental makeup, and this is good, this is beautiful. The grasses and the flowers in the field are diverse, the trees and the clouds are diverse. God's garden is rich and beautiful, it has abundant forms and glitters with colours and views. So again then, one sees the theme of diversity, which is contrasted to the universalism of the West, and the West's desire to turn everything in the world into a copy of itself. And this theme was taken up by the Eurasianists, a group of Russian émigré scholars who came to notice with the publication of a book called Exodus to the East, shown here. The Eurasianists advanced the theory that the lands and peoples of the former Russian Empire, and then of the Soviet Union, formed a natural organic whole. To support this theory, they brought to bear evidence from a multitude of academic disciplines. This is what nowadays we'd call a multidisciplinary research project. Okay? So they got botanists and linguistics and geographers and historians and ethnographers, all producing stuff, okay? Endeavoring to show, for instance, that the Russian language had a lot of words with Turkic roots, but Russian folklore and music were very different from that of Western Europe, but had a lot of common with that of India. That the flora and fauna of Russia and Central Asia were actually pretty common, but different from Western Europe, right? And if you put all this together, you know, the lands of the Soviet Union are a natural being, a natural whole. Okay? And as such, it followed that European Russia, Siberia, the Caucasus, Central Asia were one natural unit. And therefore Russia was neither European nor Asian, but something entirely distinct, Eurasian.
What date, Bob?
1921. Okay? To give some of a context of this, so they were railing to some degree against Western colonialism and saying how the West was, under repressing peoples and blah, 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 and homogenizing everybody and so on and so forth. But then you have a problem, it's like, well, surely Russia's an empire too, so how do we justify the Russian Empire in the form of the Soviet Union staying together? Because surely that's colonialism too. So their answer is, no, it's not colonialism, because this is one natural being. Okay, these people belong together. Anyway, it follows from this that Western models don't apply to Russia. One of the founders of Eurasianism, Nikolaev, remarked that a universal human culture identical for all nations is impossible. Efforts to achieve a universal human culture must be repudiated. Are we being...
No.
Oh, okay. At the same time, however, Eurasianists clung to the idea that Russia had a mission to save the world. Okay, which is kind of odd considering you're saying things don't apply to it. So the revolution was seen as a sort of cathartic experience which had allowed Russia to cast off its previous decadence. And once communism had fallen, would allow it to resurrect its ancient Orthodox culture and bring the light of faith to the rest of the world and thereby save it. Okay? So another Eurasianist, Piotr Sawicki, said, Russia took upon herself the burden of searching for truth on behalf of herself and for the benefit of all. And another one, Piotr Sulczynski, noted that the burning Russian flame is rising up over the whole world. Every Russian, without exception, is infecting peoples and lands and preparing unprecedented glory in the coming age. So in Eurasianism, one sees a very striking combination of anti-universalism and a sense of universal mission. In due course, Eurasianist ideas spread into the Soviet Union, most noticeably through the works of Soviet ethnographer Lev Gumilyov, who was son of the famous poet Anna Akhmatova. And he devoted himself to a study of the steppe peoples of southern Russia and Central Asia and developed a complex, quasi-scientific theory about the nature of ethnic groups, or ethnoi. So according to Gumilyov, ethnoi are natural products of the biosphere, okay, which is an idea taken from something called cosmism, which is very odd. And I can't really go into it here, but I'd love to, it's super interesting. But anyway, so the division of human beings into ethnoi is inevitable. But ethnoi which enjoy certain complementarities with one another can join together to form a super ethnos. But super ethnoses can't join together. Rather, Gumilyov said, a super ethnos opposes itself to all other super ethnoi. Okay. So in Gumilyov's scheme, Western Europe formed one super ethnos, while the peoples of the Soviet Union formed another, meaning that conflict between the two was inevitable. And to make this point, Gumilyov said about rewriting Russian history in a very dodgy way, so for instance to prove that the Mongols and Russians had never been enemies, but in fact had been allies against a common enemy, namely Western Europe. So Gumilyov defined ethnoi in terms of behavior rather than race. Each ethnoi's behavioral stereotype, as he called it, was a product of its natural environment. Since every ethnoi's natural environment was different, what was suitable for one ethnos was not suitable for another. One could not, therefore, say that there are any universal human values, let alone universal social, economic, or political systems. Thus, Gumilyov wrote, the global patterns of ethnic history must immediately disavow the principle of Eurocentrism. Gumilyov was a great admirer of the steppe peoples and a strong opponent of racial theories of ethnicity, praising the Soviet Union as a multiracial, multicultural, multi-faith empire. His work provided the means through which emigre Eurasianism allied itself with Soviet ideas of anti-racism and anti-colonialism. And since then, they've lent themselves quite well to the idea that Russia should stand at the forefront of the struggle against the universalism associated with Western liberalism, which is often portrayed as essentially racist. This can be seen in the works of post-Soviet Eurasianists, the most prominent of whom are Alexander Panarin and Alexander Dugin. So Panarin was initially a supporter of liberal reforms, but changed his mind after seeing the chaos into which Russia descended in the 1990s. He was influenced by what is called the European New Right, in particular French philosopher Alain de Benoit. Benoit argued in favour of the right of difference of local cultures and against the homogenizing forces of modernity and globalization. Writing that the international struggles of the future would not be between different ideologies, but between those who want the world to be one-dimensional and those who support a plural world grounded in a diversity of cultures. You can see how that fits in quite well with everything I've said so far. So Panarin took this idea, and on the basis that Russia embodied Dostoyevsky's style all humanity, proposed that Russia was ideally placed to lead those who opposed one-dimensionality, saying, is it possible for humanity as a whole to advance into the future not on the basis of cultural disarmament and depersonalization, but preserving mankind's cultural civilization and diversity? We can answer this question positively if we can find a civilization that has no pretensions to solve problems separately. Doesn't Russian civilization meet this criteria? Being distinct from the West and being aware of its distinctiveness, it has nevertheless never revealed any tendency to separate arrangements, let alone to discard its responsibility for the fate of the world. So in Panarin's scheme, Western civilization is universalistic and wishes to spread throughout the world, turning everybody into a copy of the West. Whereas Russian civilization is built upon the recognition of the value of diversity and is content to let others be. Russia, then, can help create a world founded upon polyculturalism. In this way, the universal and the particular, once again, come together. The New Right also influenced Alexander Dugin, seen here with me. I thought that would be fun to show. So Dugin views Russia as a multi-ethnic European civilization and regards Western, especially American culture, as innately racist, because it asserts that it represents universal truth. Dugin says, American values pretend to be universal ones. In reality, they are a new form of ideological aggression against the multiplicity of cultures and traditions still existing in the rest of the world. And like Panarin, he regards Russia's mission as being to oppose American-led globalization and forge an alliance with other cultures to defend a polycultural world respecting the diversity of civilizations. Where Dugin makes his original contribution is in allying Eurasianist philosophy with the ideas of geopolitics, such as those of early 20th century English thinker Alfred Mackinder. So from Mackinder, Dugin took the idea that the fundamental feature of international politics is struggle between maritime and continental powers. In the context of the 21st century, this means an inevitable struggle between, on the one hand, the maritime Anglo-Saxon world, Britain and America, and on the other hand, the major continental power, Russia. This struggle, says Dugin, is unavoidable. It's just an inherent feature of geopolitics. Okay? And therefore, since Russia is locked into an inevitable struggle with the Anglo-Saxon maritime powers, it must act and lead a global coalition against American hegemony, which he says should include Muslims and Christians, Russians and Chinese, both leftists and rightists, the Hindus and the Jews, in effect, just about everybody. Okay? In leading this coalition, Russia will act as the protector of traditional values, which are allegedly being undermined by Western liberalism. And Dugin has helped popularize the idea of katekon, which is a biblical word meaning something along the lines of the thing which shields the world from the Antichrist. So, in World War II, Russia shielded the world from the Antichrist of Nazism. Okay? Now, it will save the world by defeating the satanic forces of Western liberalism. Okay? So like so many other Russian conservatives, Dugin fervently rejects universalism, while at the same time claiming that Russia has a universal mission. It would be wrong, however, to suggest that all Russian conservatism share this sense of mission. There is, in fact, a long-standing isolationist strand of Russian conservatism, which takes the view that Russia should look after itself and not worry about the rest of the world. Okay. Russia for the Russians was the original mid-19th century slogan, which was not an ethnic racist thing. It just meant, you know, why should we go fight for the Bulgarians? You know, Russia for the Russians. In modern times, this is most often associated with the persons of Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Vadim Tsimbirsky, who I showed him.
Yeah.
Solzhenitsyn took the view that communism had so damaged Russia's moral values that it needed to withdraw from the world and focus on developing its inner being. Tsimbirsky took this thought and then allied it with geopolitics, okay? And in the process produced a rather different geopolitical idea than Dugin. So Tsimbirsky developed the idea of island Russia. He rejected the idea that Russia should try to undermine American hegemony. Okay, the destruction of the existing world order could bring great instability, which would not benefit Russia. Okay. Instead, what Russia needed to do was to isolate itself as much as possible from the world's troubles and concentrate on developing its own internal resources, ideally shifting its core towards Siberia. And geography made such a policy possible, said Tsimbirsky, because Russia was like an island. It's protected from the north and the east by sea, on the south by the deserts and empty steppes of Central Asia and Mongolia. It's only on the west, but there aren't any sort of natural island-like frontiers. So what Russia therefore needed to do was create essentially a buffer zone in the west. And if it could create a buffer zone in the west, it could then withdraw into its island. And he spoke of what he called limitrophy states. And the limitrophy states are essentially the buffer zone. Okay? And when he was writing in the early 1990s, this meant the former Warsaw Pact and the states which had broken away from Russia, Soviet Union, such as Ukraine and Belarus. When Tsimbirsky developed this concept, this string of neutral limitrophy states existed, but by the early 2000s, NATO and EU enlargement had advanced into the limitrophy states and therefore threatened the buffer zone. So shortly before his death in 2009, Tsimbirsky somewhat modified his theory to say that if the West encroached too far, then Russia would have to push back, okay, in order to protect the island. Okay? And this gives rise to the theory of what has been called offensive isolationism, okay, which sounds innately contradictory. Okay? But it explains to a certain degree what's happened in Ukraine. So Russia's actions in Ukraine are normally interpreted in the West as sort of some attempt to undermine the international order. But from a point of view of Tsimbirsky followers, it's something very different. Okay? The West is pushing into Russia's buffer zone, making it impossible for Russia to live in isolation in island Russia. And therefore Russia is pushing back, not in order to undermine the global system, but so that Russia can live in peace in isolation. Now, Tsimbirsky's ideas had a strong influence on a group which emerged in the 1990s known as the Young Conservatives, although, of course, they're my sort of age, so they're no longer very young. One of the most prominent of this is Boris Mizhuev, shown here, who for a while ran the op-ed page of the newspaper Izvestia. And Mizhuev has developed a theory of what he calls civilizational realism, which he believes holds the key for securing peace between East and West. The realism part of the theory derives from an idea Mizhuev has taken from Tsimbirsky, which posits the creation of a 1.5 polar world. There is to be one major pole, the United States, which Russia and other minor powers will not challenge on a global scale. But at the same time, there's to be space for those minor powers, including Russia, to have their own much smaller spheres of influence, and so to be half poles, thus a 1.5 polar world. So in effect, Russia would accept US hegemony, but the US would accept that Russia has some say over what happens in its immediate neighborhood. The problem Russia faces is that the United States doesn't seem to be willing to accept such a deal. Why not? Well, Mizhuev sees the answer as almost the reverse of what Danilevsky said. Danilevsky proposed that the problem was that the West saw Russia as different. Mizhuev says the problem actually is that the West doesn't see Russia as different. I had lunch with him about a year ago. He asked me a couple of times, like, why did Nixon go to China? Why didn't he go to Moscow? Like, in the long term, China's way more threatening, and Russia's a much more natural ally. So why did he go to China? Why did he go to China? Because it's because there's some innate sort of Russophobia among Americans. Okay? And why is that? Well, it's because we recognize the Chinese as different. And because we recognize them as different, we don't really get very upset when they behave in bad ways, or what we consider bad ways. But the Russians, we kind of think they ought to be like us. You know, they're Christian, they're white, you know, we read Dostoyevsky and Tolstoy, you know, they should be like us. And then we get really upset when they're not. Okay? And this is the root of the problem. Okay? So according to Medvedev, you'll never have peace between East and West until the West is willing to recognize that we are separate civilizations. And it's once that recognition is given, then a settlement along the lines of a 1.5 polar world is possible. So, as Medvedev puts it, we both need to understand that the language of civilizational geopolitics guarantees Europe's survival. Another prominent member of the Young Conservatives group, or former member, is Mikhail Remizov, who runs a think tank called the Institute for National Strategy. Remizov categorically rejects the idea that Russia has some mission to save the world. That sort of thinking has brought Russia nothing but harm, he says. But he draws a distinction between universalism and universality. Okay? Anti-universalism, he says, is not a different form of universalism. But it is something which potentially everybody could agree with. So therefore it has universality. Okay? Russia needs allies, says Remizov. It therefore needs an idea with universal appeal. Okay? Anti-universalism fits the bill. By putting itself at the head of an international movement rejecting the universalist claims of Western liberalism, as well as the homogenizing effects of globalism, Russia can acquire the allies it needs to protect itself and live in safety and isolation in island Russia. So he's an Simbisky. So the question now arises of what effect all of this has on Russian policymaking. So if you ask Dugin and Medvedev how much influence they've had, they'll tell you quite frankly, none at all. The conservatism of the Russian state is and always has been very different from that of conservative intellectuals. Outside of the Soviet era, the Russian state has been, and I believe still is, decidedly pragmatic and non-ideological. It has tended to be very suspicious of conservative ideology. I mean, the Slavic Files, for instance, were forbidden to publish anything for most of their lives. So the conservatives, the Russian state does not like conservative philosophy. And in the present era, we see that the Russian state and conservatives disagree on some key issues. Most notably, conservatives are generally committed to anti-globalism, but the Russian government has tried hard to integrate Russia into the global economy through acts such as joining the World Trade Organization. Because of these differences, conservative intellectuals, for the most part, regard themselves as being in opposition, albeit loyal opposition. Having said that, senior officials such as President Putin and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov do share some of the conservative perspectives discussed in this presentation. The language of conservative discourse has become quite common among Russian elites. This includes concepts such as Danilevsky's idea of civilizations, Leontiev's flowering complexity, and Panarin's polyculturalism. For instance, in an article about the history of Russian foreign policy, Sergei Lavrov remarked that there are many development models. Long-term success can be achieved on the basis of the movement to a partnership of civilizations based on respectful interaction of diverse cultures and religions. Okay, this is straight out of the conservative playbook. It's also noticeable that when people like Putin and Lavrov, or more probably their speechwriters, are looking for quotations to give philosophical justification for their policies, the sources they tend to use are those mentioned in this presentation. Dostoyevsky, Leontiev, Ilyin, Gumilyov, and so on. You'll find them all in Putin's speeches. So does this mean that conservative philosophy is directly influencing state policy? Well, not necessarily. These connections are very hard to show. The appeal to conservative ideas may be merely a means of intellectually justifying things politicians have chosen to do for purely instrumental reasons. Having said that, politicians' speeches are political. Okay? So when you are quoting conservative ideas, you're doing so because you think it appeals to the mass audience and to your elites. Okay? So they clearly believe these ideas will resonate with the Russian public. And the reason they resonate is because, to some extent, these ideas have percolated downwards into public consciousness. Okay, so things like Slavify, the ideas over the past 160 years have sort of percolated into public opinion. So in some rather indirect way, yes, the ideas have had some effect. I don't want to overplay this, and there's many other things going on as well. In the process of percolation, these ideas have inevitably been much simplified, as they have, I must say, in my talk as well. If you're talking about the way ideas affect policy, it will be in a very bowdlerized, highly simplified version. Okay? So I'll finish off by asking, what is the highly simplified version of what I said today, which may be said to be the legacy of Russian conservatism to Russian international relations theory? Well, very roughly speaking, it's something along these lines, okay? Russia is different from the West. How it's different? That's a matter of very considerable debate, with massive disagreements between, say, Eurasianists and Russian nationalists. But the key point that Russia is different is broadly accepted. As a distinct civilization, Russia is in possession of certain truths which the West does not possess, either because it never had them, or because it's become atheistic and decadent and forgotten. Western liberalism, therefore, cannot claim to be universally valid. And it follows that different civilizations should be allowed to follow their own path of development. And this is a good thing. Okay? Flowering complexity, diversity, polyculturalism are to be encouraged. This requires Russia to protect its sovereignty and to push back against attempts to impose Western liberalism on the rest of the world. How much Russia needs to push back, again, considerable debate, huge disagreement between, say, Dugin and Simbirski or whatever. Okay, but the idea that there has to be some resistance to this is common for all. But finally, in pushing back, Russia defends not just its own interests, but it also acts for the benefit of the world as a whole. Okay? In this way, the pursuit of the particular serves the universal good. And I hope that all makes sense. I'll stop and hopefully have some comments.
This is great. So we have more than 30 minutes for Q&A. Who would like to start? So why don't we go in the order clockwise? Yeah, sir.
Oh, thank you very much. My question is, you didn't mention at all how the loss to Japan in 1905, how did that fit into the overall picture? And I sort of see in China, they see themselves as being a great civilization, long one they sort of lost because it became too isolated. And now they were in a new phase, where it seems in the Russian mentality, isolationism still seems to be part of the game, but isn't that what caused them to lose in 1905?
Well, the problem with the 1905 thing is it just got massively overshadowed by the First World War and the Revolution. So in effect, it had no real effect on Russian views of the world because everything else just, if the First World War had not come along, then it might have had some effect. But as it was, everything else just bulldozed it out of historical memory almost. Right?
So there was a question right in the back first. Sir.
Right now that Canada has troops in Latvia, and you've got 15 minutes for a war to start, how is the universalist approach or the isolation approach seen in Russia towards these Baltic states? Are they part of the international universal system, or are they isolationists that have to be brought back into the fold?
Well, I mean, you get, all these things are a matter of considerable disagreement. I mean, I think that Ukraine and the Baltic states, or at least part of the Baltic states, would be seen as being part of the Russian cultural world, what they call Ruski mir. Okay, so they are part of the Russian world in terms of culture. Okay, and therefore particularly Russian nationalists will feel some sense of duty and obligation to protect the rights and interests of Russians in places like Latvia. I mean, Latvia just a month ago, banned Russian language education. Okay. This is the kind of thing, so 30%,
Publicly funded.
funded public education. Right, so, 30% of the population speak Russian or something, this kind of thing really upsets Russians. Because it's seen as like overt racism, which no one seems to be bothered about in the slightest. Which again, evidence Russians would see it as double standards, right? So, yes, in that sense, they're seen as part of the Russian world. On the other hand, I think there's a recognition that these are gone, right? I mean, I don't. Perhaps Dugin has sort of grand schemes, or a massive sort of multinational empire. But I don't think many people adhere to that sort of thinking. Okay, I mean there's a strong dose of pragmatism which would say this is gone. Ukraine though is still kind of up for grabs. Okay? What the future of Ukraine will be is not settled in the Russian mind.
Dr. Friend? No. Alexander Getchu, next.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Bob. This is fascinating. I'm wondering if you could help us understand a little bit more the role of Russian conservatism in the broader intellectual landscape of Russia. How important are they? How influential? What are the main opponents or key allies? And also, more specifically, in the field of IR, what does Russian IR theory look like? How influential are the conservatives compared to other schools of thought? And then the final question, I don't know if you have time to address it, if you could link the contemporary Russian conservatives to let's say Western counterparts, the most influential conservative thinkers in the West, both in terms of sociological connections they might have, but also intellectual connections. I know it's too much, but I'll just...
Yeah, I wouldn't want to overplay the importance, having just given a talk on it, and also like downplay the importance, because conservative intellectuals are, they will admit that they are sidelined, that the state is not desperately interested in them, and so on and so forth. That said, if you look at influential international relations type publications, not academic ones per se, but ones which academics would write. So you come to Foreign Affairs or something, right, here, like Russia and Global Affairs, okay? There's quite a lot of this sort of thinking going in there. So Vladislav Surkov, who's a well-known member of the administration, he recently wrote a piece for Russia and Global Affairs, which read as if it had come straight out of Symbirsky, which saying, okay, we've had it with the West, we've tried, it's just like, it's time to just slink off into splendid isolation, it's very reasonably important figures. Sergei Karaganov, who's also associated with Russian and Global Affairs, is head of, I think, of the Higher School of Economics, for instance, or was it Mugimo? I can't remember. Anyway, but so places like Mugimo, HSE, these sort of the intellectual powerhouses, there's quite a lot of people who write and think in this sort of way. Okay, so they are there, and they have some influence on the margins. There are more prominent groups like Izborsky Club, which are have some influence again. Sergei Glaziev, who's a guy, he's called an economic advisor to Putin, but he is in the sense that he's allowed to give reports to the government, which the government then immediately throws in the waste bin. So the government sort of, it says to the conservatives, yeah, come on, we'll let you consult with us, but then it doesn't really follow that, right? So it's there. It's one of a number of currents. It has some influence. It is, I think, reasonably reflective of sort of public opinion in terms of these sort of ideas. I think sort of are a better reflection of what many Russians think than what you get out of state policy, which is often more globalist. I mean, the Putin has had a lot of, this is not understood in the West. Everyone thinks it's also Putin's fault. Putin does not get stick from the left in Russia in terms of foreign policy. He only gets stick from the right. Even the communists attack him from the right. He's always accused of being weak, okay? not defending the people of Donbass, allowing the Americans, helping the Americans in Afghanistan. Okay, the pressure is always for a more aggressive, more nationalist, more assertive foreign policy, not for a lesser one. So in many ways, the Russian state is comparatively liberal, westernizing, pro-European, compared with Russian public opinion and Russian intellectual opinion, I would say. Okay. As far as links with Western conservatives, I mean, Western conservatives don't much speak to Russian conservatives. There's some links in America. So some American church groups have reached out to the Orthodox Church, and there's connections between the evangelical churches and the Russian Orthodox churches. And the Russians they'll make friends with just anybody who's willing to talk to them, because they're so desperate to have anybody to talk to them. So this often leads to like accusations of links with the far right in Europe and so on. But basically, they'll just talk to you if you're willing to talk to them. It's not that they have a particular preference for Marine Le Pen over anybody else. It's just Marine Le Pen talk to them, so they'll talk back. You know. But I think it doesn't go much deeper than that. I think Marlene Laruelle recently wrote a piece saying that a lot of this stuff is over-exaggerated about Kremlin links with the far right and stuff.
Question over here.
Yeah, I have two questions regarding this similar. First one is, where do they trace the line of Russian civilization? Because they were talking about the empire and then about the Soviet Union, and now it's Russia, which does not have the same borders. So where does this civilization end and start exactly? It's not clear. I mean, according to like those conservatists. And yeah, and how can they justify Russification and Sovietization if they say that Russia is a multicultural country? Like, how do they justify the whole process of Russification that happened during the Soviet Union?
Okay, those are good questions. If you go back to Dostoyevsky, who originated the civilization idea, he was a pan-Slav, so he saw the civilization as being not a Russian civilization, but a Slavic civilization. Okay, so Russia's mission was to bring all the Slavs into a single civilization. This annoyed a lot of other Russian conservatives who said, like, screw the Bulgars, you know, Russia for Russians. Leontiev was totally against this stuff, you know, he hated the Bulgars. Why should we sacrifice Russian blood for Slavs? Okay? So there are other Russians, so if you go on to Remizov, I showed a picture there, he's a Russian nationalist. I mean, his view, like Solzhenitsyn, is get rid of all, like, this collapse of the Soviet Union is a bloody good thing. You know, we got rid of all those Central Asians, and we got rid of all those Latvians.
But he's himself Central Asian, Remizov, no?
I don't know, but he's a Russian, he very much thinks that Russia has an opportunity, but multiculturalism was bad for Russia because it prevented it being a real democracy. But it's only by becoming a nation state that it can become a really democratic state. And that means it's got to be, you know, cut out, get rid of these Central Asian immigrants and so on, okay? There's far too many of that stuff. And yeah, we'd have the Eurasian Union, but without Kyrgyzstan, ideally. Okay, we can have the Armenians and so on, but, you know, certainly not all those. So there's that, both Russian nationalists, then there's Eurasianists who would identify the civilization as basically the boundaries of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet peoples as being the Russian civilization. So there is no agreement on this, just as like there's real problems among conservatives who, like, what are they conserving? What's the national identity? Is it, you know, is it all of Russia's history? In which case, like, the Soviet period too is part of Russian history. So how do we, like, praise Imperial Russia and Soviet Russia and post-Soviet Russia and bring it all into some cohesive whole? And, you know, there would sort of be anti-Soviet conservatives. Most of them, though, kind of want to, like, somehow mold it into a common history. But it's really difficult. Okay, so there's no good answers. As for Russification, I mean, it didn't really happen. Actually, I mean, if you look at the history of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union created all these other nations within its soil. It gave many of them language, literature and alphabets and educated elites and institutions and created nations where nations had not existed before. So Soviet talk of merging into a Soviet people was very much a variance of what Soviet policy actually did. Okay? And what Soviet policy actually did was what was called Soviet-informed national culture. So national inform, Soviet in content. That's the word. So that, as long as you pledged allegiance to the Communist Party, speak Georgian, write in Georgian, we'll create a Georgian elite, Georgia can be run by Georgians and so on. And so in many ways that was a model, that's what the Soviets would call, Russians now would call the polycultural model, which they would contrast with multiculturalism. Okay, multiculturalism is bad because like Western multiculturalism, you say, oh, it's so multicultural in Canada, but basically we try and assimilate everybody and turn them into Canadians, right? Whereas in the polycultural model, the Mordvinians are still Mordvinian, and they have a Mordvinian republic and a Mordvinian elite and a Mordvinian language, so on and so forth, right? All within one Russian empire.
There's a question here.
Daniel Price with University of Melbourne. I thought it was a fantastic talk. I did wonder a little bit more about the connection between Soviet or Bolshevik thought, how those encounters, what they look like, how they encounter similar ideas around a multi-ethnic kind of empire, similarly along those lines. But I also wondered if you could say a little bit more about the way in which they conceptualize capitalism and forms of domestic hierarchy.
Right.
Because capitalism, of course, is a problem for conservatives, particularly if one wants a hierarchy.
There are variations between Russian conservatives. There's what we call liberal conservatives, who I have not had time to go into, which is a very a long-running strand in Russian conservative thought. Liberal conservatives are basically the people who more or less run the country nowadays, who believe in a strong central state, but at the same time are quite liberal in terms of their economic viewpoints and want to integrate Russia into the global economy and so on and so forth. Okay. But they just don't believe that, Western-style models of government will enable that to happen. Okay. This gets criticized by other intellectual conservatives, mainly as liberal authoritarianism. And they would say that liberalism is authoritarian, okay, in Russian context, whereas conservatism is democratic. And they tend to be, and I think this is the more widespread view among conservatives and liberal conservatism, they tend to be economically left-wing. So Russian conservatism, I think, throughout history, economic and social issues were never really big in the imperial period until very late, because it was mainly a cultural thing, sort of some reaction to westernization. It took them a while to get into economic issues. When they did, though, they tended to oppose top-down modernization, and tended to argue that what you needed was bottom-up modernization. So instead of having industrializing by getting foreign loans and having high taxation on the peasants and protectionism, okay? That was, they said, was bad, A, because it put you in hock to foreigners, often interpreted as Jews as well, but also because it suppressed domestic demand. And they said it's much better to have a loose monetary policy, print lots of money, low taxation, free market, free borders, and then you put money in the pockets of peasants, and then that will stimulate bottom-up growth. And you get similar ideas in the modern era, which would be, they were very much against the very tight monetary policy of the Russian state. Okay, so the current Russian state has a very tight monetary, often seen as neoliberal macroeconomic policy. Conservatives are generally against that. They would like freer money, lower interest rates, loans, cheap loans to small businesses. On the other hand, they're not free traders. They tend to be protectionist, and they tend to believe in social justice, and they ally the orthodox idea of subordinist, sort of collectivity, with economics, and argue that economics must have a moral element, which involves social justice, an advanced social welfare system, more investments in education and healthcare, and doing something about these bloody oligarchs who have got far too much money. Okay? So conservatives economically very much put themselves against the economic policies of the existing state. And against globalization, they would argue for regionalization. So they would say, we are opponents of globalization. But we are supporters of regional integration, particularly within the Eurasian Economic Union. Does that answer?
Great, Arlington.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Super talk, really fascinating. One of the things that I found really interesting was the time at which this emerges, the 1840s and onwards, which is the time when we see a lot of other particularistic or panisms emerge, so Pan-Asianism, Pan-Arabism, Pan-Africanism at the same time as this Slavist movement. And when I listen to you and when I look at your slide here, flowering, complexity, diversity, polyculturalism, the same kind of vocabulary, slightly different, but the same ideas you find in all those, Pan-Arabism, Pan-Africanism, Pan-Asianism. So I don't know if you can speak to what it was at this particular time in the 1800s and up to the early 1900s that stimulated this. I mean, this very strong anti-Westernism that comes around at that time, which I thought is a fascinating aspect of it. My specific question is, on your slide here, what to your mind, could you put some more flesh on your bones on what to your mind Russia is currently doing to prevent the imposition of Western liberalism on the rest of the world? You mentioned religious connection between the Orthodox and the evangelicals, the world of Congress and families and so forth. But what to your mind are they actually doing to prevent it?
Right. On the first thing, just from a historical point of view, I think it's, I don't have a very good answer to you because I'm not an expert on these other panisms. But it does feed into sort of debate historians have about the extent to which these ideas were a Russian phenomenon or really part of a more broader phenomenon. And therefore, the extent to which Russian conservatism is really Russian or not. Right? And different historians have very different views on this. I think it's a mixture of both. I think they were building upon Russian ideas, but the same, and particular Russian context. But these Russian conservatives are, as I say, all very westernized people who read foreign philosophy and speak a lot of languages, right? So they, I think, were thoroughly in tune with the zeitgeist of their time, and they still are. Okay, so Russian conservatives don't just sit in Russia and think Russian thoughts. Okay, they're very much tuned in to what is happening elsewhere. The second one was, what are they doing? Well, there's a limit to what they can do because they're just not very powerful. I mean, and there's a limit to how much they want to push it. Because if you're sort of Sibirskiite, you don't want to push it too far. You're not actually interested in challenging American hegemony. You'll just want to push back a little bit, just to keep this view. My view of the Russian state is it's something closer to Sibirsky and Dugin. Okay, but really, they're not interested in challenging American hegemony or Western liberalism per se. Okay, let alone these ideas that they want to destroy American democracy. It was crap, and that's just rubbish. Okay? But then they don't care if you're liberal and democratic or whatever in Canada. Okay, what they really want is just to be left alone, more or less within their own bit. But that they recognize for that they're short of friends, so they're looking for allies. And to some degree, in doing so, they're going back to the Soviet sort of anti-colonial era of finding friends in the developed world. So I was invited to Moscow to what was called the International World Parliamentary Forum or something. Okay, as sort of expert. It was there weren't many people from Europe there. Okay, I was the only one from Canada. There was like one person from America, and he's a well-known Kremlin's dude. The guys from Europe who were there, AFD, National Front. There was a former French minister, Mariani, who is Republican, so therefore he's centre-right, but not. But he's like notoriously pro-Russian, so it's just like he's kind of an exception. So you wouldn't have. There weren't really people who you'd say were distinguished or noticeable, important from Europe, from the West. But from African countries, from Latin American countries, they sent high-powered delegations. There were a lot of speakers of parliaments there, coming from Africa, from Peru, Brazil, from Arab countries, for instance, and they seem to be taking it quite seriously. Now, of course, getting the friendship of Swaziland is not much of a compensation for losing the friendship of Britain, but it's something, right? So I think that's kind of what the Russians are doing. They're trying to We're trying to pick up friends in the developing world. And this kind of rhetoric, I think, it plays well.
My question was the effect of this conservative thought in the legal field
Right.
and justice system, because the definition of this conservative thinking would, to me, sound like a common law nature of growth and going back to what we have and developing based on that, which contrasts what Western societies are trying to push with human rights and human rights laws and international laws that are decided somewhere else in Central Europe and implemented all around the world, or trade laws, that sort of thing. Do you think that the recent justice system in Russia is trying to follow up some local common law system that is based on conservative thought?
There's been a couple of articles actually written about this. There is something of a conservative pushback in the Russian Constitutional Court, for instance, particularly Mr. Zorkin, who's the chair of the Constitutional Court. Just this week he said that the Constitution should be changed. And the Constitutional Court has begun to push back against the European Court of Human Rights. Russia gets sued a lot in the European Court of Human Rights. Up until now, it's had a very good record of doing what it's told to do. It gets sued more than anybody else, but it's better at actually doing what the European Court tells it to, compared with, say, Italy, which just ignores whatever the ECHR tells it to fairly wantonly. But they are getting a little pissed off, I think, with what is seen as European interpretations of human rights. So they're not against, and therefore beginning to say, look, we have a right to interpret these things in our own way, rather than in your way, okay? And what's gone wrong is that you're trying to impose your own way of interpreting this stuff on us, which doesn't fit with the way that we see it. So if you look, for instance, the Orthodox Church, which published a few years back a statement on rights, they don't disagree with rights, which actually for an Orthodox Church is remarkably progressive compared with the past. But they do have a different take on it, which is that, you know, rights are connected to human dignity, and human dignity is inevitably connected to morality. Because if it's immoral, it can't be dignified, and therefore, you know, human rights can't be distinct entirely from morality. And the problem with Western human rights thought is that it has divorced itself entirely from moral thinking. So the Orthodox Church has, you know, a big list of actually rights it says people have, you know, freedom of speech, freedom to vote, participate in government, all sorts of things we'd agree with. But then, you know, there's certain things which it would not include in that, particularly to sexual rights and gay rights and stuff like this. This stuff is in there, but, you know, Russia has at the same time committed itself to being part of this global legal system. So it's pushing back and it's distancing itself a little bit, but it's not cutting itself off entirely from it.
Kazim, and then I guess we have only time for 2 more questions. So Kazim
Just
first.
a brief comment. It seems that it's the West who's meddling in the Russian affair rather than Russia meddling in the US elections or in other affairs. So which is true, which is more true, that is it the West who's meddling into Russia, or is Russia who's meddling or trying to push its agenda in the West?
My view is that all major states try to influence other states. In fact, every state tries to influence other states. Okay? We do it, they do it. You know, sometimes we get a bit moralistic and call it meddling, but ultimately, you know, I mean, we're all just trying to influence each other. That's part of human behavior. So yeah, the Russians are trying to influence the way we think, but I don't regard it as particularly unusual or odd or to constitute, you know, an assault on our democracy or whatever. Simply because Russians would say, you know, my God, you meddle in us, you know, and they like to bring up the 1996 cover of Time magazine, which shows, you know, how we won the election for Yeltsin. it's right there on the front cover of Time magazine, and of course Americans did, and a lot of money was spent on it. and maybe say we have double standards. It kind of amused me. I think it was last week. There were some complaints about Russian meddling in the Macedonian referendum, right? And the Russians had ruined this referendum, and word had come out that some Greek people with Russian connections had spent $12,000 on this referendum. And then in the same article, without any sense of irony, I think this was in The Guardian, it said, the United States spent $8 million supporting the referendum, supporting a yes vote in the referendum. So somehow, like, some Greek guys who have some connections to Russia constitutes Russian meddling in the referendum, but the United States spending $8 million directly supporting the yes vote isn't. Okay, my view on this is like we're all trying to influence each other all the time. They do it, we do it, and I don't see a huge moral difference between us.
Last question. Sir.
You talk about buffer zones and friends. I'm failing to see how Russia is trying to reconcile those, because it's mostly isolated, means its neighbors, Georgia or Ukraine or the Baltic states. So what steps is Russia now taking to befriend, I don't know, like Baltic states, Poland, Finland, Ukraine, those neighboring countries, we could say? Are they doing anything in that sense, or they're just going all the way to developing countries in the rest of the world and they're forgetting their buffer zone?
Well, they are trying to create they are working on the European Eurasian Economic Union, which is a way of integrating some of the Soviet space into something similar to what the Union was when it was just a European Economic Community. So it's not really a political project, it is mainly an economic project. But politics follows economics to a certain degree. That is one thing doing. Russia is also, of course, involved in many other regional bodies, such as the CTS, Commonwealth, or what it stands for now, and the I'm getting Alzheimer's. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and a whole bunch of other regional institutions and initiatives which are going on. So where it can, it's trying to get friends, but it's not in a very strong geostrategic position.
So can I add a point to that?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
There are 6 million Russian speakers in the European Union, and there's a demand that Russian be added as an official language. The only way they could do that is if one of the member states would add Russian as an official language, and it most likely would be Latvia.
It should be said, another problem with Russian is there is no Russian lobby or Russian diaspora in the same way as there are like Ukrainian diaspora or Sikh diaspora. Although we have a lot of Russians in Canada, they're completely ununited. They often don't get on with each other. They represent a whole different points of view. They came at different times. The Russian lobby, in terms of winning friends, is relatively weak compared with lobbies of other groups, which again reduces their ability to influence strong customers.
This has been great. We've been talking Russia for the past 80 minutes. Thank you for coming and participating. Join me in thanking.